What if the United America collapsed in the late 18th century? Part 2. When we last left off, the Deep South had just conquered much of the Southwest from Mexico in the Mexican-American War. The Deep South would reach a struggle with the Mormons in securing their new territory. In our world, the Mormons wanted to move into Mexican territory so that they could create their independent Republic of Deseret without much interference. But when the U.S. won the Mexican War, they were in the middle of U.S. territory, and so they still declared their independent territory of Deseret, but United America was easily able to destroy them. But in this world where the American continent would have at least three powers on it, it would not be hard to imagine that at one point one of the powers would want to arm Deseret against the Deep South to prevent the Deep South from getting too powerful, and to generally be a thorn in the Deep South's side, and supply Deseret with money and weapons. And so, this would create a attritional situation in which the Deep South would simply let Deseret be independent because the land is practically worthless. Until the 1840s, no one was really sure where the border between British Canada and the United States was in the Pacific Northwest and in the Northern Plains, but President Polk secured a line at the 49th parallel, which is where the Canadian and U.S. border is today, through an agreement with Britain. But in this world, the British would not be negotiating with the United States. Instead, it would be negotiating with the state of Pennsylvania for the border, and that would hold a lot less clout than the United States. And so, Britain would get the better deal out of the deal. And so, cities like Seattle and Duluth would be part of Canada in this timeline. New York and Boston would not be as important as they were in our timeline, in this timeline, mainly because both of those places need to be attached to a superpower to be important. New York as a funnel for goods between the Atlantic and America, and Boston as an intellectual center and a center of technology, because Boston wouldn't get the investment from a major power in technology and education that it did. New York and Boston were replaced by Philadelphia and Baltimore as major cities, mainly because Philadelphia and Baltimore would be attached to the nations of Pennsylvania and Virginia, and thus would be ports for those cities, and would be connected to the surplus of those nations. Another big change in this timeline from our timeline would be that cultural diversity ranging from accents to food to music would be much more different. And this is because in our timeline there was one United States, and it chose which part of the United States it considered American, and it considered the rest basically just regional groups. And in our timeline, that was basically the Midwest, Mid-Atlantic, and California's cultural region, and the rest was basically considered margin. But in a world with several different American nations, each would consider their own culture vital to their own nation, and so it would split off in different cultural directions. Slavery would last much longer in Virginia and the Deep South, mainly because those countries wouldn't have had the large populations of Northerners that would feel angry by slavery existing, and those so they wouldn't have gotten rid of that institution for much longer. Also, the northern countries like Pennsylvania, New England, and New York wouldn't have had large populations of Southerners who would want to maintain slavery, so they would get rid of slavery very quickly. In our world, the Deep South wanted to conquer the Caribbean and Central America to get more slave states, but the North didn't let them because the North wanted to maintain the balance between slave and free states, and it didn't want the evil institution of slavery from spreading across more of the world. And so the South didn't. But in a nation run completely by Southerners, like the Deep South in this timeline, they would have no issue conquering Central America and the Caribbean. Pennsylvania wouldn't purchase Alaska because it wouldn't really have any interest in purchasing Alaska. Pennsylvania would only have one port on the west coast, being Portland, and it would be unwieldy to control Alaska having such a small Pacific coast. As European politics got more high stakes and Byzantine in the late 19th century, it's not hard to believe that a similar thing would have happened in the US, since at this point all of the American nations would have conquered their territories from coast to coast, and they'd be looking towards each other to continue their power growth. The southern nations of Virginia and the Deep South would ally with Britain and France because they would be their greatest trading partners, barring Pennsylvania, and they would need to get a strong naval ally to help protect them against the industrial supremacy of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, by far being the most powerful nation industrial on the continent, would quickly see itself surrounded by enemies, with Virginia in the deep south on its southern border, and British Canada on its northern border, and so it would ally itself with the other industrial surrounded nation, who is the enemy of Britain, being Germany and the Central Powers. Meanwhile, Deseret would side with Pennsylvania, not wanting to become part of Dixie again, and New York, with such great ties, trade-wise, with Pennsylvania, would likely side with them. Also, New England would likely remain neutral, having trade ties with both regions and not wanting to be involved in a horribly devastating war. Virginia in the 19th century was an economically and culturally split state. The eastern half was controlled by the first families, who were descendants of the original settlers of Jamestown and the later 17th century colonies. One of their famous members is Robert E. Lee. They were mainly slave-owning, and were much more wealthier than their western counterparts, the Appalachians, who were generally of Scots-Irish descent and did not own slaves, and were mainly subsistence farmers in the western hills. As Virginia moves west, it would carry these issues with it, with the first families being the wealthiest and most politically powerful, would want to take the best lands, while the Appalachian peoples would feel they were cut out of this entire deal, and the system was staked against them, and so they would want to rebel and shake off the control of the first families, and get the nice lands out in the west. Pennsylvania would be happy to funnel weapons and money into any possible revolt in the Appalachias against Virginia, and thus tensions would start to arise between the two powers, and it's not unlikely to see the spark that created World War I being lit in Virginia and not Serbia. The war might also start in Serbia like in our timeline, but both of them are viable starts for World War I, and it generally depends on which keg was lit first. Meanwhile, in Europe, the fighting would go on as it did in our timeline until 1918. This is a map of where the American fronts would generally be. America doesn't have the population density and is just too big to have trenches going from coast to coast, but they would likely develop in certain regions. The most fought-over front would likely be the Mid-Atlantic front, in between northern Delaware and Havre de Grace in Maryland. And there would also be fighting in the central Midwest for control of that region. There would also be fighting in the Great Plains, as well as southern Canada, as Pennsylvania and New York forces would try to invade and conquer Canada. If the war started with a spark being lit in the Appalachias, the war would have a rebellion in Virginian-controlled Appalachias very quickly on in the war. But if the war started in Serbia, the Appalachians would rebel against Virginia as Virginia began to experience suffering from the war. I know it sounds completely insane looking at this map and the size of the allies in America, but I think the Central Powers would win in America, mainly because their region would comprise more than two-thirds of the entire continent's industrial power, and so they could survive a long war of attrition much better than the powers around them. And what else is World War I than a war of attrition? Also, they'd have the largest population on the continent, and thus would be able to last out a long trench war better than their enemies would. After the end of the war, the Virginian Empire likely be split something along these lines, with independent meaning an independent Appalachian republic. Meanwhile, the Deep South would leave the war fairly unscathed, because it would have no borders with Pennsylvania worth mentioning. Meanwhile, Canada west of Quebec would be annexed by Pennsylvania because it would be conquered during the war. Meanwhile, Quebec and the Maritimes would remain parts of the British Commonwealth because Pennsylvania would have no real border with them and thus wouldn't really have a way to conquer those provinces. To totally change the topic, in Europe, without the American forces to help the Allies at the Second Battle of the Marne, the Germans would seize Paris and win World War I. In about a third of my alternate histories, the Germans win World War I, and this isn't anything wrong with my alternate histories, it very possibly could have happened. But, because it happens so often, I'm just going to have a card go by explaining what would happen if the Germans win World War I. Enjoy. Slavery would end in Virginia as part of the 1918 treaty, but it would end in the Deep South in the 1930s when tractors would be able to do the work that slaves used to be able to do for cheaper. Also, poor whites would start to be angry at the wealthy slave owners who could live out the Depression more easily with slaves working depressed wages. Most of the film industry moved to California because they were trying to escape Thomas Edison's crippling patents on film technology, and Thomas Edison couldn't reach them in California, and so that's why Hollywood started in California. But if Southern California was part of Dixie, the New York-based film industry likely would have started in Oregon or in Washington instead. World War II would start similarly to our World War II, with the fascist powers of Britain and France allying with the Soviet Union would try to take down the Kaiser's supremacy, and this would inevitably drag the Deep South and Pennsylvania into a war with each other. This is roughly what the war would look like in America, with the Deep South allying with Virginia, which would want to regain its old glory, as well as New England, which would realize that if it didn't fight with Virginia and the Deep South now, that Pennsylvania would destroy all of the other nations on the continent and become supreme, as well as Eastern Canada, which would be part of the British Empire. Meanwhile, Pennsylvania's allies would be the Republic of Appalachia, which wouldn't want to be reconquered by Virginia, as well as its old allies of Deseret and New York. World War II would likely just end like World War I in this timeline, with Pennsylvania's victory due to sheer industrial and population overpower. The war would also likely be a Central Powers victory in Europe, because without the Americans to help out on the European front, Britain and France would likely lose the war, while the war in Russia would likely drag on into a stalemate. I'm not entirely sure which side Imperial Japan would side with, but it doesn't really matter because Imperial Japan would put itself on whatever side it could conquer the Pacific with, and they would generally be successful because the US would be too busy fighting its own war on its own territory. After the end of the war, the American nations would be shell-shocked from the long and bloody wars they had fought each other, and so, to prevent another war from happening like it, they would likely create a Pennsylvania-led North American Union, which would try to prevent a future war and try to engineer trade deals between the surviving American nations. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please comment or subscribe. What if Altist? Thank you for watching.